Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. My name is Thekla von Bülow. I'm co-head of Advisory Central Europe. Today I'm very pleased to welcome Daniel Breuer, who's a partner at Osborne Clarke. This is a podcast preparing for Aurora's Berlin Renewables Summit, which will happen this Thursday on the 11th of May. The topic of the Berlin Renewables Summit this week is coordinating the German state and market policies and strategies to reach 80% renewables by 2030. Daniel will be participating in a very exciting panel, which is going to talk about especially the regulatory interventions and their impacts on the PPA markets in Germany. So this podcast will be a pre-discussion on the topics that we will touch upon on the panel on Thursday. So to quickly introduce Daniel, as I said, he's a partner at Osborne Clarke, heads up Germany's energy and utility practices and advises clients on all energy and regulatory matters with a particular emphasis on renewable energy projects, direct marketing, and especially PPA structures, which is the topic of today. He's regularly involved in transactional and project finance work around renewable assets in Germany and across Europe, and all types of renewable energy-related disputes. He's also a member of the Legal Advisory Board and participating in several working groups with the German Federal Wind Energy Association. Welcome, Daniel.
Well done, Thekla. Thank you. And as always, good to speak to you.
Awesome. So just kind of to give our listeners a general overview of what we are talking about, which is the PPA markets, which stands for Power Purchase Agreement, so direct contracts between an off-taker, which can be a utility or a corporate, and a supplier of green power, which can be a developer, utility. It is a market that has really developed over the last couple of years and has really picked up at the start of 2019 and has had its ups and downs since then. So, Daniel, what has been your perspective on the PPA market in the last 2-3 years, maybe starting with the pandemic and then going through the gas and power market crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Thekla. Indeed, it's been a very interesting ride, kind of a bit of a roller coaster ride. I've been now involved in the renewable energy industry for more than 10 years, taking care of power marketing, tariff projects, and since 19, it's been indeed very interesting. We started off with post-tariff wind farms, trying to find off-takers and building up a bit of a learning curve to see where the market was going. So obviously in 19, also in 20, we mainly saw so-called utility PPAs where IPPs, plant developers, would contract with experienced utility off-takers who for years took care also of tariff-based marketing. So they knew what they were doing. So the shift was mainly going from the market premium model, which is the basis for subsidized plants, to fixed price and fixed floating volume or as produced volume PPA structures. And we've seen a very steep learning curve since then. So we started off with what everyone knew, contract with the utility, sign a short-term contract for 2-3 years, up to 5 years. try to only commit to what the plant actually produces, because obviously post-tariff means assets which have run for more than 20 years. And this was also a bit end of life structuring. So one couldn't contract long term. So that was the starting point. And very quickly in 19, and even more so since 2020, we started to look at PPAs for new installations, which is the actual point of a PPA, trying to connect the producer and the consumer to integrate renewable power into the market. And that's also how it's now been defined in the Renewable Energy Directive as what is a power purchase agreement. And with that, we saw slightly starting more visibility of corporate off-takers. First of all, defining the demand, because one needs to understand if the utility off-taker signs an upstream PPA, so he purchased power from a renewable plant, if he does that short term, it's fine for him to hedge it at the power market, because the power markets are liquid for, let's say, up to 5-7 years. But if you look into the real PPA market, so long-term contracts, 10, 15, 20, 25, up to 30 years we see in Germany, you cannot hedge it at power markets. So what you basically do is you find downstream a industrial consumer who contracts the volume that the utility has procured from the producer. So we realized the whole market was structured around the demand and appetite of corporate consumers trying to contract green power and trying to get hands-on guarantees of origin. And that over the last couple of years led to also a huge learning curve of the corporates, the industrial key players, who then started to question, can we not actually sign these contracts ourselves? Do we need to only get these inked from utilities? And do we need to have the three parties involved, or can't we do it directly? And what we've seen in particular over the last, and that's also during pandemic with all its ups and downs, in particular for the projects, we've seen much more drive towards corporate PPAs. So contracts that have been concluded between the plant operator, the producer, and the corporate off-taker directly. And big names out there from the chemical industry, INEOS, BASF, big names out there from the automotive industry with Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, or whomever. So it's huge corporate off-takers who have capabilities and the need to contract lots of gigawatt hours to contribute to their ESG, CSR requirements, to contribute to reduction or achievement of their climate goals, right? And along this learning curve, we also saw extension of PPA tenors, where we started off more shy-ish with 10-year contracts, which is still the majority, but moving also towards very long-term commitments, where Deutsche Bahn, for instance, likes to contract for 30 years. We see more contracts being signed for up to 25 years, which come along with a few legal nitty-gritty challenges, but these can be overcome. And what we also learned over the last years is with people or stakeholders gaining more know-how, we see also more flexibility around supply structures, where we sometimes mix either as produced to as forecasted, where we split up tranches and have some as produced or as forecasted, or some more merchant floating. We often also see still demand for baseload products, which, from my perspective, you will very likely have a view on that too, Thekla. But the probably most expensive product one can structure. But we have, and we might still talk about that later, certain challenges integrating volatile renewable production into existing supply relationships for corporate off-takers. So this brings some challenges along, and of course the easiest way to estimate, to forecast how much volume you get is of course as a baseload band, but a baseload band from a wind turbine, it doesn't really work well. So
it's a particular challenge for Germany for sure. The base load. I mean, the utilities that I talk to usually either provide a volatile profile with some additional guarantees of origin and grey power mix that they would then call a base load, or are trying to get hydro assets from the Nordics to then call it a German base load. It's definitely a difficult profile to achieve in Germany with the amount of renewables that we still currently have. Yeah, Daniel, it's interesting to hear about your perspective, especially the development of the corporates. There's a massive interest in corporates, as you say, from a decarbonization perspective.
And maybe just to add one aspect, and that's also maybe interesting, and this is also a decarb aspect as such. What we also see is a move towards direct wire constellation. So players trying to find locations nearby production sites, industry parks, to not go through the grid. We've seen in parallel, basically, for ramping up PPA market, we've seen a terrible, disastrous implementation process around redispatch. So we realize that the power grid is a bottleneck, and the power grid is also key for making energy transition work, which is why we do also see a trend for developers and corporates teaming up to find sites where solar or wind projects can be developed near to their industrial sites, and supply through direct wire, and only feed into the grid whatever cannot be consumed at the site. This also brings along quite some interesting legal points around how to structure it from a constructional perspective, how to secure a grid access, grid connection, also from a bankability perspective. Because that should not be forgotten. Most of these projects, almost all of these projects, are still project financed by banks. So also the banks have a huge learning curve on which structures are bankable.
Absolutely. So what is interesting is also the trend on longer term PPAs, as you said, and the fact that PPA prices are very much dependent on the starting point, which is the liquid market period. So the derivative prices, while at the same time we're trying to look to price a very long-term contract. What I'd be interested to hear, Daniel, is basically since the start of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the prices due to the gas market constraints have really soared in Europe and have led to massively volatile prices in Europe, but also obviously in Germany. And one of the responses was for the EU countries to implement a price cap of 180 euros per megawatt hour as a general rule, and different implementations on national basis. So in Germany, actually stricter rules for the renewable production. How have these price caps affected the PPA transactions that you have seen recently since the price cap was announced and also implemented?
Well, where to start? This is, I mean, this has been almost uncharted territory, what we've seen over the last 15, 16 months since the invasion. Impressive on the one hand side to see how much legislative power there is within the EU and also within Germany. But on the other hand, it's also I say interesting to see how much can go wrong if you lose yourself in detail. And I think Germany has contributed heavily on many cliches that unfortunately are deemed German when it comes to bureaucracy, a lot of technical detail. And yeah, you mentioned it, Germany decided, even though we have a strong voice within the EU, to go the German way and come up with a stricter way of capping revenues and trying to skim off windfall profits from these high volatile prices and to ease the pain of consumers. And as a first point, it affected all the PPA negotiations heavily because every legislative act, once it's published or leaked or once rumors spread, it just creates uncertainty. And if you just look back, I don't have a number, but if you look back at the last 24 months, how many new legislative acts we've had in Germany on renewable power, on gas levies, on power levies, on revenue caps, it's been uncharted territory, I would say. So
so what you're saying is basically the uncertainty that it creates about how will it be implemented, for how long will it stay. It seems to have slowed down a lot of transactions. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So it made all the negotiations. Sorry, I lost myself in detail, but it made all our negotiations more complex because while actually negotiating a PPA, we were always also keeping everyone involved and updated on recent developments and how these mechanisms will be implemented and which PPAs will be affected how, depending on when they are signed. And one example I can give without naming involved parties, we've started to negotiate for a 3-digit solar farm throughout the summer. And we were planning on signing the PPA with delivery start January 2023 by the end of October. And we on the final stretch just realized, okay, something's coming. So we agreed on specific mechanisms as change in law, addressing this situation particularly, and to not let it be governed by a general broad change in law clause. But because we said we want to sign, and however it's going to come down, depending on how the project will be affected, we just have to sort it out. And by the time we approached signing end of October, we had no clue. We knew the discussions at EU level, but we had no clue what was coming down the German way, that we would actually have to be benchmarked against hypothetic revenues. And in the end, we signed for, as things are, availabilities of people getting execution versions ready. We just signed a couple of days late, beginning of November. And that was the 1st of November in the end. So the law was enacted in December with transitional period for all the PPAs signed before 1st of November being safe and within the, let's say, applicable value mechanism. But all the PPAs signed afterwards were exposed by the spot benchmark model. And this, for our project, led to having to amend and call for an extraordinary termination clause that we foresaw to avoid negative cash flow starting in January. So that was just one example. But we realized some projects just never were signed because of the uncertainty, because no one wanted to take the risk. In the end, lots of projects went back into the EEG because the risk was too high, with banks involved. The risk departments in banks, they're risk averse, obviously. So they really want to know what's on the table and how this project will go down and what the PPA actually means for the project.
Yeah. At the same time, obviously, there's still a lot of pressure to decarbonize. So all of kind of those movements are still there. In my perspective, it was really a first shock for the market to get accustomed to the new uncertainty, the new world of uncertainty, I would say. But we see activities have picked up again. But you mentioned a very specific legal term, which I would like to clarify a little bit. Obviously, I will take the opportunity to ask the lawyer to clarify this. So you mentioned the change in law clause, which is being cited a lot now as being sort of the magic tool to get yourself out of a lot of situations. I wonder how, generic this clause is, and in what cases will it actually take effect? Because from a PPA supply perspective, obviously you want to have certainty. You mentioned the banks. You want to be sure that not every new developments on the regulatory side will make your PPA be ineffective. So maybe you could shed some light on it. The reason why I'm asking is that we will touch upon another topic where the change in law will probably play a role just after that.
Yes, it does. It does indeed play a major role, and the underlying concept means, so two parties agree to sign a contract for a very long time, and I'm not speaking about even if you only signed for 5 or 10 years. Given what we just discussed, how many legislative acts we've seen in the last 24 months, we know the law is going to change once the contract's been signed. So the underlying idea is the parties reached an economical agreement based on which they want to engage into a PPA. And they know rules are going to change, but ideally we want to just stick to what we agreed. As the lawyers many decades ago, or centuries ago said in Latin, pacta sunt servanda. So you want to keep a contract. If you sign a contract, you want to stick to it. And the concept of change in law is actually to make this happen. So it says if after signing the rules change or the economic technical circumstances change that significantly, that one of the parties is no longer able to fulfill their obligations or is affected by a new law in a way that it becomes economically unbearable for him to just fulfill the contract, then X, Y, Z happens. And what that actually means, what that triggers, also slightly depends a little bit on what the parties agree. But typically what you try to achieve is, if something like that happens, first of all, both parties are bound to sit down at the table and see what can be done to adjust the contract as little as possible to get back to the initial economical understanding the parties have reached. And that can be agreeing on additional obligations, slightly shifting the risk, or slightly adjusting mechanisms that have been agreed, right? And
so it's less about terminating the contract right away. It's about finding a solution.
That's the first step. That's the first step. So there's, of course, there are scenarios that cannot be healed easily. And that's the second point. To the extent the parties cannot settle amicably on an adjustment, or simply an adjustment is impossible because that's not relevant for PPAs, but in theory, you sign contracts where one supply of product or fulfillment obligation will become a criminal offense. Who knows? We've had sanctions, embargoes. If you agree to supply Russian oil or Chinese products who are, I don't want to go into detail, but then you might be bound because it's affected by sanctions and you can no longer fulfill. So you need to do something about it. So ultimately, if you cannot settle, there's always going to be a termination right. But termination needs to be the measure of last resort. And that's also what the law in Germany foresees, a mechanism like this in the civil code, but up to very, very high hurdles. And that's why we always advise it's a good idea to include change in law clauses, because this way the parties have the opportunity to agree what's going to happen if something happens and what are the thresholds or benchmarks that should trigger termination. Because the banks, for instance, they hate terminations. So they want things to just work out because they want their money back. So the idea is to try to adjust if possible, make an amendment if possible, and only if it's not possible, you terminate. And one last important aspect, if the contract addresses one particular risk to one party, then this is out as a question for being adjusted. And that's, I think, one of the most important points to understand. You cannot use a change in law clause to adjust anything afterwards, whatever you don't like anymore. So it is a restrictive clause, a restrictive tool that is designed to keep a contract up and running for a long period of time,
right,
but to not afterwards make a bad deal a good deal.
So it seems to be there needs to be kind of a really valid material risk or change in order to have an effect. So on that now, I would like to touch quickly upon one topic that in Germany is being discussed quite a bit, and that is the perspective of potentially having an Industriestrompreis, so an industrial power price or power price for the industry to be implemented in Germany. We don't have all the information yet, but it seems that the German government or the Ministry for Economics and Climate is considering supporting the industry by giving them some price stability. We're hearing talks about €6 per megawatt hour, which would obviously be substantially lower than the power prices that we have seen in the last coming months, at least until 2030. And at the same time, also a reinforcement of what we call the contracts for difference, so a two-sided CFD for the support of renewables, both offshore wind and eventually also onshore wind and solar. And as a third pillar, a support of PPA markets in terms of eventually providing, for instance, a public off-taker guarantee security, so kind of the government stepping in to overcome default risk. So there seems to be some measures that speak for the PPA market and some that might speak against it. I'm particularly interested in your views on that first part. What would a €6 per megawatt hour Strompreis for the industry, so power price for the industry until 2030 mean, both for existing PPAs, but also how would that incentivize future PPAs maybe?
Oh, well, if you ask a lawyer has to answer by starting with it depends. Sorry for that.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, I had to, because it does. So of course we're following all these discussions and information flow closely, and we fully understand where this is coming from, because in a way we've had a mechanism which works different but comparably in our Renewable Energies Act for many, many, many years, where we've had exceptions from certain levies, which was the basis for renewable subsidy funding. Every consumer had to pay its share, but certain industrial corporates were exempted from paying the so-called EEG levy, which in a way is a reduction of prices, right? So this is a redesign of something we've had for decades, and it really depends how it's going to be structured. First of all, who will be eligible as an industrial company to benefit from these reduced prices, and then second of all, who's going to pay for it? We hear that the economic stability funds might just compensate the corporates. Then it very much depends if that compensation also works if PPAs have been signed already in the past, if PPAs will be signed after this law will be enacted. This would, of course, bolster the PPA market, but looking at this a bit historically, they will do what they can to prevent windfall profits. So I cannot imagine that they implement a mechanism where you can just agree on whatever price, and then the difference between 60 euros and the PPA price will just be compensated. I mean, obviously.
Yeah, it seems to be like the PPAs that have been closed somewhat would need to be included in that compensation mechanism. Elsewise, I would assume you again will get in those kind of change the law discussions again, where a PPA has been closed for, I don't know, 85 euros per megawatt hour. And the industry Strompreis is at 60. A PPA then that has been closed and wouldn't get that delta as a compensation would clearly be in a disadvantage. So I don't see any way of not including PPAs, right?
Yeah. I hope so. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, this currently triggers high uncertainty, and we've just today, this morning, received a message where we are almost about to sign with a huge industrial player where they say, until further notice, we won't be signing. We just have to wait until we know how this is going to fly, if we're safe in signing, or whether we'll be bound from being eligible to get this compensation. So it already affects PPAs that haven't even been signed. Not even speaking of the ones that have been signed in the past. So this is one to watch for the coming days and weeks, because this will be a very important decision, how to structure it. Also, given the very painful experience we've made on the revenue cap system, where they over-engineered it from a legal perspective, so to say.
Yeah, and in a very short time frame also, if you look at normal regulatory time frames, there's a lot of decisions that needed or have been made in that short time span, leading to a lot of work for a lot of lawyers, I can imagine. So I think the key takeaway for me here is that the sheer uncertainty around how things will go, even if it could potentially actually be positive for the PPA markets, such as, for instance, this default guarantee mechanism that I was talking about, or also on an EU level, the EU proposal on the power market design also very clearly supports the PPA market in every sense of the word, supporting SMEs to get access to the market, but also enabling utilities to again, increase liquidity of the market, which would reinforce the PPA market as well. So there's a lot of good ideas, but again, we see that just uncertainty is slowing things down, unfortunately. Before we come to an end, there's one topic, a bit of a different kind of topics, but still related to the PPA market that I would like to touch upon, because I think it's quite interesting for the German market and people don't speak about it enough. And that is, we are seeing a trend across Europe from moving to physical PPAs to virtual PPAs, so virtual or financial PPAs, being PPAs where there is no direct physical delivery, but they are a financial derivative, i.e. a pure financial transaction, while at the same time enabling corporates, for instance, the same direct access to the guarantees of origin, so the green certificates, which they are looking for to certify their green power activities or decarbonization activities. There seems to be a kind of issue around virtual PPAs in Germany, makes it quite difficult. So I'd be keen to hear more about where you see the problems around virtual PPAs in Germany.
Yes, this is indeed very interesting and very recent. So if you look at the PPA market a bit more on the, let's say, European copper plate geographical reach, there are certain markets which have been virtual markets for many years. For instance, Spain, or some also markets in the Nordics. The concept of a virtual PPA is basically you bring your physical power to market. So you sign a route to market agreement where the power has just been sold at the power exchange, spot market, for instance. You agree on a reference or settlement price, a fixed price with your counterparty, and that's your PPA price. And depending if the reference price, the spot price, is lower or higher, one party or the other party will compensate only the difference. And the only thing that's been delivered under the PPA are actually GOOs. So this is a bit of a different way. And the concept is to make this a bankable PPA. So it's a long-term basis on fixed price that banks use for structuring project finance. Only the cash flow slightly deviates, where you get your cash flow as a project from the spot market, and you are secured sort of the PPA price. If the spot market price is higher, you pay the delta to your counterparty. If it's lower, you get the difference between spot and PPA price from your counterparty. So as you said, it's a financial instrument. It's a derivative. So it's subject to financial markets regulation, because as any derivative, you could also bet on the development on corn prices in Africa, or whatever it is. So it's completely unrelated, in theory, unrelated from the actual project. If you sign a virtual PPA, it is in fact not, because of course you still hedge the production and you still deliver GOOs, but it's a different way. Why do we actually have this discussion? Why are we looking into virtual PPAs? And there's two main triggers. First of all, it's new players accessing the German market, global tech companies, the Amazons, Googles, Facebooks, Microsofts, and the likes, who are typically only signing virtual PPAs globally to live up to their global ESG policies, but they don't want to go through the complexity of handling physical power. And that's also the second aspect why we're looking into this, because supplying a end consumer, a corporate off-taker with physical power, makes you as a power producer an energy supply company, a utility, from a regulatory perspective. So you have to comply with certain regulations, and also around electricity tax and some reporting obligations. But the highest complexity is integrating a volatile production load profile into an existing full supply contract. So if you look at a corporate industrial off-taker who has a couple of industrial sites, producing entity. He will have one supplier typically who takes care of, let's say, all-inclusive power supply. And they will engage into some level of portfolio management. They will contract at a futures market, a certain share of their demand, and integrating a volatile solar or wind portfolio into the existing supply structure is a hassle. So it always depends on getting your existing supplier on board, figuring out how to integrate the best structure.
Generally sounds much easier on paper to close a virtual PPA. Yeah.
Exactly. So you cut off all the physical hurdles, but this brings you to financial markets regulations, and this is a completely different world with a different authority and market regulator, and completely different rules. And these rules are intended to protect the end consumer, the you and me, typically from huge platforms such as TikTok or whomever, where big money is wired. Wired is a good reference. So the laws they're not designed for virtual PPAs from renewables, but still they apply. So we're trying to bring together these worlds, and they sort of clash, and there's a lot of uncertainty around who's actually doing what. Is someone acting as an agent and someone advising on two other parties, signing a derivative, which is a regulated role, a regulated undertaking, for which you need a license. And if you pursue this without having a license or without being under some exemption rule, in bad cases, this can constitute a criminal offense, or at least you can pay penalties. So this is a very serious area of law where you don't want to make anything wrong. And in the past, the market regulator hasn't really looked at this part of the sector. So we have uncertainty, and we're trying to figure it out and trying to work with the regulator in understanding which concepts and which structures will be deemed as what type of financial market undertaking or whatnot. And it sounds easy, but it currently isn't, because we're not there yet. But we're let's say on a good way in figuring it out, and hopefully soon be able to advise which structures are safe. We already have certain structures which are safe if they're set up from the beginning, but we only advise people before engaging into virtual PPAs to get proper legal advice, to be sure it's set up in a safe way, because otherwise, without having the feeling you're doing anything wrong, because that's exactly what two parties want to agree, and there's no household customer, no private individual involved who needs to be protected. The law still applies. And this is slightly irrational, but sometimes the law is irrational.
And this seems to be a very German-specific problematic, if I understand this correctly, because we have seen a lot of virtual PPAs, for instance, being closed in Spain, where I have not heard of the BaFin getting in the way. Why is that kind of so German-specific?
Well, so we. And maybe that's just about the market maturity. The underlying laws are mainly actually EU laws. If you look at MiFID directive, MiFID II directive, EMIR, such as REMIT on the physical side, we have EMIR on the virtual side. So this is all EU law, but it's all enacted and implemented into member state law. So the laws between the different jurisdictions slightly vary. And some markets just have been virtual PPA markets for quite some time. And they are just these 2-3 steps ahead of us, where the financial market regulator got involved and decided, either the government decided or the financial markets regulator decided, no, this is nothing that we want to regulate. This is nothing that we want to monitor. And this is nothing what financial market regulations was designed for, and nothing we need to protect end consumers against. So their markets, either the administrative practice or the law foresees that these types of virtual PPAs are no regulated contracts under the laws. And we're not there yet in Germany. So the underlying EU law is the same.
Interesting. Yeah. So it seems to be that probably Spain has already sorted it out or thought it through. Hopefully we'll get some more clarity in Germany around it, given I do see a lot of potential in virtual PPAs. As you said, it can have a lot of upsides for corporates to not necessarily having to change their physical power procurement, but there's other complexities around virtual PPAs that make it not an attractive option for a lot of corporates, including the effects that, for instance, it has on your accounting, so putting it on the balance sheet. So lots of topics. Well, thank you very much.
That's the second point. Indeed, IFRS accounting is also a bit of a pain when you need to account derivatives, but it is a hassle, but it's manageable. At least we know how to do it right. With the financial markets regulations, we don't know yet exactly how to do it right, but there are certain ways in doing it.
Perfect. Well, thank you for covering a bit that additional topic, which was related directly with the first topics that we discussed. And we will continue that discussion actually on the panel of the Berlin Renewables Summit on Thursday, where we'll be joined by different representatives from developers, utility and industrial off-takers. So we will have those varied perspectives, and I look forward to that discussion with you, Dan. Lots of uncertainties in the market, slowing down the PPA transactions. Really interesting to hear your perspectives on the likes of the power revenue cap, but also the potential around the industry power price. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Thekla, and I'm very much looking forward to our panel and the Berlin Renewables Summit on Thursday too. So thanks for your time and the opportunity to speak, and I look very much forward to seeing you on Thursday.
That was Thekla von Bülow, Aurora's co-head of Advisory Central Europe, talking to Daniel Breuer, partner at Osborne Clarke. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.